For those of you who know her, Annie Williamson and I, we run the social media wing of Oxfrep, which is one of the journals that does macroeconomic policy in Oxford. And one of the things we do is tweet articles on a regular basis. Check it out. But one of the things we both noticed is that there is a stunning macroeconomic consensus among people who claim we have simply not learned the lessons of the times of the Great Depression, and that the era we now live in is repeating those mistakes and has done so to the detriment of literally millions of families around the world. So the alternative we stand for is a return to the post-Great Depression realization that we do need things like the separation of investments wings of banks and savings wings, things like the Glass-Steagall Act, things like the limitations on the types of products that the financial sector can use, things like the burden of proof being placed on the new instrument to prove its validity and safety than on regulators who are often undermanned and stretched to prove that these things are not dangerous. It's a return to a time of transparency of ownership and to a time of greater regulation overall. I'm going to do a few things. First, I'll explain quickly the effects of this mass deregulation in the past as a retrospective debate. Second of all, I'll tell you why the spectrum of loans created on net were harmful. Number three, I'll do the trade-offs for you in this debate and why economically we should not have taken that deal. And last of all, a quick suggestion on why mass deregulation that is harmful feeds itself. No, thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Is there some sort of comparative you're standing behind? What does the alternative economy look like?
As I said, I think the alternative economy is filled with more restrictions on capital. Perhaps it is a bit slower, but I suspect it also has less horrifying lows. Number one, effects of mass deregulation. I want to be quick here. It looks like things like incompetent and unaccountable credit ratings over large tranches of loans that created the subprime mortgage crisis. It looks like things like loans, both internationally and domestically, being bundled together under the illusion that diversity creates safety, but in reality not recognizing that bundling together very similar loans means that you are pooling risk. You're making it more likely that that things go wrong and that hurts the economy en masse. Or things like products which are simply so complex that even to this day, regulators are still trying to trace the full economic effects in terms of financial institutions around the world. All of these things, and obviously I can't tell you all of them, created a huge amount of structural weakness and instability. And that created a cycle. I will briefly describe this cycle because it has been documented in many economist articles. When individuals lose confidence in the ability of certain institutions to pay back, these institutions either default or they call in their loans on sort of the lender's end. This often creates things like contagion in the financial sector as confidence, a lack of confidence rather, spreads across the entire sector. Lots of loans are called back in. There is a drying up of capital for companies who need to operate on the basis of lending. No, thank you. Well, that dries up. It means companies shut down. It spreads to an economy rather than just the financial sector. So it looks like things like foreclosures, the shutting down of factories, defaulting on debt, individuals losing their jobs, being stuck in credit card or mortgage debt, etc., etc., etc. It makes things terrible for people. And look, even if you don't buy all of this logic, as an average reasonable person, you have lived through this. You have lived through the last 8 to 10 years of an experience that has taken away, in terms of not just, maybe not for yourself, but your families and friends, the very things which made up the basis of a stable middle-class life. So, now, they're going to say that these harms were worth it because on net, loans were made and those loans are necessary to lubricate a global economy. But I want to walk you through the spectrum of loans that were most commonly made. There are three types. The first are very unproductive gambles that don't actually create real value in the economy. These are things like options or futures or like shorting certain shares that extremely rich individuals can use to make gambles and bets on the likely prospects of an economy in the next 2 to 10 years, depending on how risky you want to be. But note, none of this actually increases capital in the economy. The vast majority of these investments don't increase value in any meaningful sense, other than the fact that it provides an opportunity for people who are already wealthy to take that wealth and increase that wealth further. Second of all, they propped up bubbles. They looked at investments which looked like they could increase forever, like houses, and said, I will buy one today so that in the future, that price will go up and I can sell it and turn it for a higher amount of profit. But of course, lots of these things were not responsive to actual market supply and demand factors. That's why when they realized no one was actually buying these houses, the prices crashed and there was no clear necessity to make loans for these houses in the first place. Now the third class, and I suspect this is the minority, are the legitimate loans, things like college students and so on and so forth. But note, these individuals were fucked over badly because they took loans from similar institutions or connected institutions to institutions that were making loans with the first and second category. So even if there were individuals who got these legitimate loans, that supply of credit got taken away when the financial crisis happened. You might have been midway through paying your legit mortgage or your legit student degree and paying off that student debt when suddenly the economy crashed and you couldn't find a job. So even to the extent there was some good done, a lot of that was undone when the large-scale crisis occurred. Let's move on to the trade-offs. I want to be very explicit about 4 observations here. The first is that the gains of such growth were localized to capital owners and to CEOs who were in the best position to take these risks. It's about people who got away with large bonuses or bailouts because they could depend on governments to say, the economy is so important, we will save your jobs because that's for the greater good. These gains were concentrated amongst a select and lucky few. On a moral basis, it's just not clear to me why we should value these gains. Who took the losses? The losses were taken by millions of people across swaths of the Midwest, not just in America, but in parts of Europe as well. These were communities who already didn't have that much, were offered what they thought was a lifeline, but in reality was a rope that had no tether at the end of it. It was about families losing their savings when banks shut down, or like losing their entire jobs, no thank you, and the prospect of sending their kid to college when the economy tanked. They did not get to keep the homes, no thank you. They did not get to keep their college degrees or put that to good use when the economy had no jobs for them to go to. The point here is this. There might be gains and it might look good on paper, but unless those gains go to a large number or to the most needy, there is no reason to value those things. No. The second observation I have is on public debt. In prosperous times, like in the 80s and 90s or even the early 2000s, there was very little saving done by governments. No, thank you. And as a result, when it came to things like bearing the fiscal cost of a bailout or of increasing welfare programs when the crisis hit, they simply were not able to take that cost going forward. Third of all, note, a lot of the economic growth in the West, it's unclear that that growth was driven by the financial sector itself. It very often corresponded with things like the rise and opening of China as a market to sell to, or like the dot-com bubble, which was a technological development and a step forward, or things like the end of the Cold War, which had a significant savings benefit because we no longer had to spend so much on the military. The point here is that there were lots of other real economic factors, other than the financial sector, that explains the reason why we had these spurts of growth. This opposition needs to tell us concretely why an increased and absolutely ludicrous amount of capital was the only way to get these spurts of growth. Last of all, note, this also weakened the West as a whole, arguably led to things like the rise of xenophobia, because individuals, having lost the prospect of a middle-class livelihood and a middle-class future, often turn against individuals who are seen as foreign. If you think about it, lots of the xenophobia that occurred after sort of bad times in the economy, basically. When times are good, there's very little hatred and there's very little desire to exclude foreigners, to the extent that we created arguably the single largest financial and economic crisis of our generation. I think we are somewhat responsible for the hatred and the populism that has occurred. For all these reasons,
I thank the Prime Minister and call the Leader of Opposition.
One, why this has increased the size of economies such that even if there are recessions, or that recessions are more likely, which we contest, and I will contest in my second point, the economies are still larger at the end. Two, why we think this has decreased financial fragility and the likelihood of crisis. And three, why this has improved access to financial markets and social mobility for the world's poorest. My point of response is thus: the case we hear from the Prime Minister is startlingly uncomparative. It makes no attempt to compare to the world that would have existed in which regulation prevented the world's poorest from an access to capital, prevented them from getting a chance at steady housing, at steady jobs, in which economies grew a lot more slowly and poverty was more entrenched, where inequality grew and xenophobia festered in communities we abandoned when they were unable to find work in economies that grew more slowly. One, why this increases this, first of all, we think post-2008, in the context of a post-2008 world, the incentive of financial actors are towards not being less risky, but the quality of risk improving, in which they are more willing to account for possible failures. But why do we think this has increased the size of economies? First of all, this is just trivially true. Countries involved in the 2008 recession still had larger economies at the end of the recession than they did in 2005. But we think this, when this happens, happens when you have these larger economies? That means there's more jobs, more income for people, fewer unemployed, we have less poverty, more people able to save for their retirement or their children's education or to feel safe and secure in their old age. But it also means that businesses are still growing, crucially, and getting products to new people, getting products to people more cheaply, and being able to employ them. But why is this true? First of all, in terms of access to loans and capital. Higher regulation means less lending. It means regulations about who and what kinds of people you can lend to. There are reserve regulations about how much banks and financial institutions need to hold in reserve compared to their lending. There is restrictions on how much institutions or individuals can borrow. First of all, especially in a high-tech economy where the vast majority of your business enterprises are highly speculative, which is the vast majority of the Western world now, banks need to be able to lend in order to create and support these industries and the people that they employ. Whereas on their side of the house, many startups that currently employ many hundreds, thousands of people in the Western world would never have been able to get access to speculative capital, which means there would have been less jobs and less people employed and more poverty, more people without the capacity to pay for education or retirement. But also businesses use this easier access to loans in order to expand, in order to build new units, in order to move to new areas, to engage in new markets. But also crucially, the easy access to capital means that business and the capacity for businesses to issue their own bonds means that it makes businesses more able to weather whatever crises does come. It means they don't pull out of communities that are then stricken with structural unemployment and unable to turn themselves around. We think that this 2008 had comparatively low firm bankruptcy compared to other recessions, which means recovery was easier. But this multiplies across sectors. When a community is not stricken with structural unemployment, those people who have jobs spend that money on things that employ other people, that then employ other people. All of those people in that chain have jobs that they can feed their children with, send them to education, improve our country and our economy as a whole. But also the money multiplier, right? If you're a bank and you have this is too high, but if you have a 50% capital reserve, you can only lend out half of your money. The half of the money you lend out gets spent on things that employs people, that creates economic growth, that helps people out. But if you cut the capital reserve, if you cut the reserve rate and say that you can lend out now twice as much money, you lend out twice as much money, but the same amount of capital, right? We didn't have to increase the overall amount of money, but you now have twice as much money available in the whole economy in terms of loans. And all of that multiplies. It's not twice as much economic growth, it's 4 or 5 times as much economic growth when people are spending it and people are using it to do other things. But also notice competition has been crucial for improving financial risk, and making people, for improving financial risk. When there's high regulation, effectively the government picks winners. It says that these institutions are going to be safe, these institutions won't be, or these institutions are the ones that we are going to keep all the time. Notice in times of high regulation, the percentage of bailouts is functionally 100, in which banks and institutions will never go under. This means that there are few new entries, so banks and financial institutions have little fear about competition, little incentive to improve their products or improve the quality of risk that they are inventing. But notice crucially, in times of lower regulation, even if there are no new entrants to the financial market, the fear and prospect, of new entrants is what drives you to improve your risk and to compete in advance of potential new entrants. Notice competition exists even without new entrants, but high regulation ensures no new entrants come into the market. You have no incentive to fear for your potential future or the potential future of your institution, and no incentive to improve the risk or quality of your products. No, thank you. We think when high regulation and when functionally institutions cooperate with the government, the same way banks in Germany did or Kaibals in Korea do, that means that you have no moral hazard when it comes to gambling with other people's money. There's less responsibility, and also the revolving door between government and between regulators and institutions is much higher. So you actually have bad regulation, but crucially, institutions feel less responsibility for the money. So we actually think there's more and worse risk on their side of the house. But also we think you have a political incentive, you have an important incentive for investors to scrutinize on our side of the house. With more competition means there's more potential places to invest, and so investors have a higher incentive to scrutinize the places they invest, which means we have better risk on our side of the house, and we think we have less financial fragility. Rory?
The only way in which your economic argument can make a comparative difference is if all of the businesses you're talking about are so bad that a law has been passed to stop giving them loans.
So first of all, we think that when you have more access to capital, doesn't matter if your business is bad or good or whatever. It matters whether it employs people. And if it goes out of business, what it would on your side of the house, those people end up without jobs. We also think this has improved access to financial markets for the poorest and most vulnerable. Access to capital helped many people get onto the housing market when otherwise they would have spent their lives in uncertain renting or living with family for the rest of their lives. That's what happens on proposition side. Housing is needed in order to invest in your future or saving. Renting means you can never save for retirement or education or invest in your children. The poor grow poorer over time as their capital is extracted from them by landlords. Regulation helps keep the poor poor and increase inequality by preventing them getting on the housing market, being able to save for the future. It abandons entire communities and increases the sense of abandonment and xenophobia that many of them feel in face of the fact they have been abandoned by a system that systematically shuts them out of being able to access capital. We also think on our side of the house, the kinds of people are investing improve. Investment is more dispersed throughout society, because regulation about who and who cannot invest changes. When it's not just a small handful of incredibly rich people, there's a stronger incentive to choose better risks. For instance, when it's pension funds, etc., investing. We think that is preferable. You should oppose.
I claim the Leader of Opposition and call Deputy Prime Minister.
Opening opposition attacks a comparative without ever really exploring what it is. They can't win this debate by proving that there has been growth in the last 35 years and that some of that has trickled down. They have to examine what would happen otherwise and prove that that is better. Given that they've given a generic case for why lending should occur to people that require loans and are willing and capable of paying them back, we want to hear from them what regulation they would enable, because the logical extension of everything they've said is that they would have no regulation whatsoever. They can't get away with saying lending is good and winning a debate about deregulation, thereby causing lending. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, exploring a little further the alternatives to the financial industry that would have sprung up in answer to opposition's cry about what would have been the alternative without ever really analysing it. Secondly, why we get better growth. And thirdly, why crises are happening. More important than growth, proven by text and crucially unresponded to by the Leader of the Opposition. Firstly, alternatives to the financial industry. It's a little unconventional to start with some second speaker substantive, but the reason why I'm doing this is going to become clear. Let's look at the context of the 1980s and realise that opposition's kind of mystery, what would have happened otherwise, isn't going to take them the debate here. What was the context? A lot of the developing countries they were talking about today, that today host the financial hubs of New York, of Hong Kong, of Frankfurt, were in a period of economic transition. They were moving away from industries like coal or steel. In the case of Hong Kong, they were rapidly developing, moving away from things like shipping to post-industrial things, moving towards services. The question then is not the fact that financial growth did happen and caused growth, it is what would the alternative transition have looked like. In opening government, we say it would have looked like things like services like healthcare, like technology. Why was that likely to be the case? 2 things. 1, we were in a situation of massive economic prosperity in a lot of these cases. Instead of putting the money, the euros, the dollars, and the cents in the halls of Goldman Sachs, we would see them going into other industries. As people were getting more and more money and more likely to be investing it anyway, we think them putting it into things like their education as opposed to in things like loans, putting it into other industries would have been preferable. The second thing is, we were seeing huge increases in education at the time. There were very smart people, very high rates of university attendance growing in these countries. We would have preferred those people do things that at the moment a lot of smart people still do, but not as many, rather than seeing the best and brightest go to Wall Street. Those are things like becoming healthcare. The opposition member has a job at a hedge fund at Connecticut. I think they're incredibly smart, and I suspect they're going to use that to make an argument for authority later. But the thing to say about that is we'd rather Kate be doing something far more interesting and far more productive than moving money about the pockets of the richest. Why is this better? Firstly, as we said in Texas speech, a lot of the subsidiary products opposition has to defend are just not productive. They wanted to take the easy case, which was loans, but things like options on those loans are, for instance, not paying the wages of the people whose jobs are lost. Secondly, they ignored Texas end point, which was that often the political ramifications of this were long term. When people did not understand why they were losing their jobs, they could not see any benefit in the way that, like, in tech, you can at least look at an iPhone and think it's pretty fucking cool. You do not understand why your money is being lost, why your home loan is collapsing because of things happening on the other side of the country. The end point of this point is that even if opposition shows that the deregulated financial industry is more productive than the regulated financial industry, it doesn't win them this debate because they have to prove that it is better than the regulated financial industry, plus where all those other people would have gone to work, where all that other money would have been invested. I think here, another thing they're likely to say, and notice here, we're OG, we don't have much time, but the language of opening opposition suggests that later on, they're going to go and say that developing countries were somehow liberated by those loans. We'd give you, in the 80s, an example of countries that did not take this path of development. Countries like the Asian tigers, who turned to manufacturing and services, and even today in countries like Singapore, do not have, like, massively speculative financial markets. We'd say that is a preferable kinds of industries, and those were better places for those countries to grow. Secondly, on growth. Opposition gives general reasons why economic growth and loans are good. You get more employment, you get more spending in local communities. The trickle down eventually works. Not why deregulation resulted in growth. Tex gave you 3 kinds of products that deregulation created. Things like gambling on subsidiary products, things like bubbles on safe things, or things that are perceived to be safe, for instance, a housing bubble. And even the good loans they wanted were made bad when they were bundled up in things that eventually collapsed. Things like Fannie Mae, Freddie, like those huge subprime mortgage collateral groups. And the fact they only really dealt with the third and didn't consider our mechanism for how that was polluted by the existence of the other products speaks to their inability to respond in this debate. What did they say? 2 things. 1, they said you get twice as many loans when the lending and liquidity ratio changes. I think when you're lending less loans, you're going to be sticking to the safe loans. As I'll prove later, that makes things less risky. But ignore the other 2 claims that we brought you. The second thing they said is that there's a mechanism of competition between financial products, between financial providers. We think that drives a race to the bottom in this debate. When you're competing to have people invest in your hedge fund, you want to get the biggest rate of return right now in the next year, even if it means in 3 years' time that loan collapses. The last thing they say here is that you get good loans on the poorest. That carries a huge third-party harm when there is a massive risk to the economy that some people getting slightly more loans at the moment is not worth. But lastly, we think the regulation of financial services doesn't often have that option. It would have happened anyway when people who can pay back loans want loans and they don't have other ways to make money, like investing in products that have no real value. They're likely to be doing the things they can do to make money, and that was giving real products. Closing.
So the most damaging consequence of the post-Great Depression regulation is probably World War II. Do you want to engage with, given the fall of the Soviet Union, why these sorts of things might have happened?
The info slide is since the 80s. If you really want to run that 1945 extension, go for it. On crises, there were no responses to any of Tex's mechanisms about how contagion occurred, about how the other products were bundled up. 2 things to say here. Firstly, why is slower growth with fewer crises better? Notice, I didn't even need to win anything that opposition rested their case on because we proved this in Tex's speech. You get less fear and insecurity when people can more gradually get money. But secondly, there are problems with huge crises for that growth later. Hysteresis effects. We think people being steadily employed at lower wages is better than having long-term and structural unemployment when entire industries collapse overnight. A second and new point of substantive under this point is we think you get more ceaseless deregulation. So if the deputy leader of the opposition suddenly says they want some deregulation, though they haven't made that clear what the limit will be, we think they make that regulation harder. Why is that? 1, regulatory capture when you have large and politically important industries in central the city, when deregulation saw credit agencies being controlled, and secondly, when, as opposition says, you can only associate that growth with deregulation, use free market arguments instead of looking at real prosperity and real people's lives on the ground, you're politically unable to have any alternatives. So proud to stand in open government.
I thank the Deputy Prime Minister and call the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
genuinely unclear what sort of Marxist fantasy land the economics department at Oxford University must look like if they say the 2 years of recession that occurred from 2008 to 2012 to 2010 had harms that outweighed the benefit of the 40 years of continuous extended economic growth that occurred prior to that. I think additionally they've been atrociously uncomparative in engaging with what the world looks like post-2008. Because yes, it's a regrets debate that takes place in the past, but this also has effects for our economy going forward, and particularly post-08, as Bethany explains to you, the type of risk that banks and other institutions are willing to engage in has changed, such that they are taking better risks that are less likely to cause these types of collapse in future. So even if they want to stand by financial crisis outweighing the benefits of extended growth, they don't win on that comparative going forward. I'm going to look at two things. One, the question of economic growth, why we get substantially more of it. Secondly, the question of risk, why we contest there is less on our side of the house. Okay, first of all, let's deal with the first claim we get, which is that the economic gains that have happened from this were neither real nor important. And we're given a few mechanisms for this. First of all, that a lot of this is just unproductive speculation in terms of you're spending it on the stock market or you're investing it there or whatever. I would point out, like one just factor, this is actually quite a small amount of the loans that were made, for the simple reason that only a small number of institutions are willing to engage in incredibly speculative stuff. Like the vast majority of investors into the stock markets are things like pension funds or things like large businesses. That's where most of the money comes from. These people want stable, long-term returns, so all of this capital has just gone to more return, to more loans for business. Secondly, though, dealing with the type that is unproductive. One, you can tax this, right? We've got huge amounts of money coming in tax, so they want to stand behind better healthcare, better education. It's easier to get this on our side of the house. Secondly, though, as they've told us, there's no separation of casino and real banking. So casino banking was still happening to some extent on their side of the house. The problem was all of the gains for that were locked up in the casino banks and could never be extended to the real economy. Post-Glass-Steagall, the gains that certain banks made from betting on the stock market, they could then use to give productive loans to businesses in China, to businesses in the Far East, to businesses in developing countries. But thirdly, even if the only effect of the stock market is to drive up share prices, that's good for companies. Why? Because if your share prices are higher, it's easier for you to borrow money and then invest that. Like, this isn't just magical money that disappears. When you invest in the stock market, that money is going to the companies because the share price is going up, making those companies more valuable, making it easier for them to borrow, making it easier for them to spend money and generate economic activity, generate jobs, all the good stuff that Bethany brought you with no response. Secondly, that a lot of this brings bubbles, but recognise these bubbles are incredibly good for the people who hold the assets that are bubbling. When we talk about things like a massive spike in house prices, that was crucial to social mobility for for poor families who had bought their houses in the 70s and 80s, who now saw their values rise, who saw they now had enough money to send their kids to college, to send their kids to university. Sure, there might have been a 2-year gap from 2008 to 2010 where kids going to university then were hard, but all the additional working class kids who only had money to afford their college fees because their parents were able to borrow against the value of their house for the 30 years prior to this and for the however many centuries going forward that are going to happen post 2008 clearly massively outweighs these kids from just the 2 years. No thank you. But thirdly, and this also deals with the third thing, that the legitimate loans were then withdrawn in 2008. I mean, sure, that's obviously a harm for the people who suffered from this, but we just say there's comparatively less people being harmed in a span of 2 years than there is in a span who are benefiting in a span of 10, 20 or 30. Secondly then, on the contention that the gains from this economic activity all went to the wrong people, I point out this is atrociously non-comparative. Why? Because on their side of the house, the rich are always able to gain money. With a smaller financial sector, where you can only invest in less risky prospects, a less risky business is one that has a very rich founder backing it, as opposed to some kid who just has a good idea and not much capital to his name. But let's take them on their best and engage with the examples they're talking about. They're giving the examples that a lot of this look like loans to go to college, or house prices to families who otherwise would not have been able to afford a house. This is clearly a massive consequential benefit, insofar as this is poor kids who could never have gone to college, families who could never afforded a house and got any capital, any money to lead their children, any money to increase social mobility. But secondly, they tell us, well, but when there's a crash, the rich are bailed out so they don't lose. But no. Recognise, the investors do lose a lot, right? Like, it was only structurally important banks that were bailed out. The hedge funds didn't. They went to the wall. People lost their jobs. But secondly, this doesn't. But secondly, again, engage with comparative. In a comparative of slower growth, what is happening? Like a business that are, like, riskier businesses looks like stuff like when there's a wobble in demand for cars, it's too risky to extend loans to that car company. If there's a sudden drop in the price of food, it's too risky to give money to a farmer to allow them to keep their heads above the water and put foods upon the table. All the hits in the real economy that they're talking about affect the calculus of risk. So if you're only allowed to lend to less risky investors, then on their side of the house, you're not lending to prop up loans to prop up business and families that could have been saved were it not for the fact that regulation was too strict. I dispute that these people don't matter and that their gains don't matter. So recognise, let's engage with this stuff in the developing world, because I think we can just win the debate on this alone in terms of access to finance. Post the eras of colonisation, it's an unfortunate truth that vast reserves of capital were extracted from the developing world to go to the West. This just meant that in a lot of the poor countries they want to talk talk about, the capital did not exist for them to invest. Now, and secondly though, if the economies of the West were still built on trade, if they were still built on manufacturing or the real economy, all of the structural incentives of these governments are then to shut poorer countries out of global markets. Why? Because if you're Britain and your economy is based on steel, you want to shut out other nations that could compete with you on steel. However, if your economy is based on finance, you want to encourage investment in these countries because that's where you can get higher rates of return, because there's less investment there, more rates of return on capital. Crucially, regulation prevented investment in these countries because, one, they were perceived as higher risk. Countries abroad, you knew less about them, they were developing economies, etc. But two, restrictions on things like currency convertibility, how many pounds you could buy and sell, things like fixed exchange rates, specifically prevented all these things from happening. So look, they're correct that the Asian tigers didn't specialise in financial development. But the question is, the development they did specialise in, where did the capital for that come from? It came from financial markets in the West. It came from the activity they label unproductive in stock markets. So even if they win on the West, even if they prove that it's somehow been disastrous for the global economy, I think the duty and the care that we owe to some of the most vulnerable people in this world outweigh that. Closing.
So they buy a house they can't afford, the mortgage skyrockets and they're saddled with debt, the bubble bursts and they lose their jobs, and you tell them they should be grateful.
Yeah, but lots of them don't. That's the point. Like, even though some of them do this, the vast majority of people weren't repossessed. Yes, they repossessed 1 million homes in America. That's still another 100 million people who kept their homes. Yes, a few kids weren't able to go to college. That's still lots more who were still able to go to college. So lastly then, on the contention, this made it too complex, so there is more risk. I point out again, it's not about the amount of risk, it's about the quality of risk. Like, because lots of stuff that I've talked about here, like keeping a business where there's been a sort of fall in demand for its products, like keeping a poor farmer's head above water, are perceived as high risk and wouldn't be permitted on their side of the house. But recognise, we think bankers are in the best place to know what this risk is. First of all, post-2008, they're much more aware of the problems of the complexity and derivatives they're talking about. So insofar as 2008 was a harm we had to eat to ensure that the financial system would take risks better going forward, we're happy for that. Secondly, the populist anger they talk about, again, bankers are concerned about this. They know if there's a rerun of 2008, lots of them are going to go to jail. They behave better and take less risk. But lastly, moral hazard and regulatory capture, as Bethany explains, is worse on our side of the house when Kaibols are having regular meetings with the South Korean government to determine their structures. There's no engagement with the comparative. They just point out, sure, it happens to some extent on both sides of the house. We contest it's worse in a more highly regulated system. I think deregulation in the past 40 years is global economic growth we're willing to stand behind. Oppose.
I thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition and call the member of government.
Chair, adjudicators, ladies and gentlemen, from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to Harry Truman to Dwight Eisenhower to Lyndon Johnson, all the way up to the beginning of Reagan's very first term, US economic policy and culture looked to align capitalistic mechanisms of wealth creation with a government which looked after the most vulnerable and empowered the disempowered. The rhetoric of American economic policy was that of the Great Society, of the New Deal, which saw the fundamentally important economic unit in society as the community, as the family, which looked to empower the people at the very bottom of that economic system or those in the middle, and that is what the success of an economic system was measured by. That changed with the beginning of Reagan's term, and that changed with the deregulation of financial institutions. It created a toxic political culture and culture in general, in three respects. Firstly, a toxic culture of individualism. Secondly, a toxic culture of consumption. And thirdly, a toxic culture of inequality. This identification is the most important thing in the debate, because to a large extent, we're willing to accept that there might be some economic benefits and disbenefits on both sides of the house, although obviously we think the disbenefits which opening government identify are larger. The important thing here is the way that you react to those economic disbenefits is completely premised on the way that you feel about your life in general and the way that that political culture is enacted and exists. So that's what our extension is about. I'm going to move through those three elements of the culture which I talked about. Firstly, with respect to individualism, mass deregulation creates a hyper-individualistic society. That's precisely because of the assumptions that need to underlie economic policy and political culture in general in order for this deregulation to occur. Those assumptions are as follows. They are that you should do whatever you want to get your hands on stuff, on a house, on a car, or whatever. That if it goes wrong, ultimately the risk completely lies with you, but if it goes right, you are not in any way to take credit for that. Rather, that credit goes to a financial institution with which you don't identify and with people who are at the very top of your society. Moreover, that culture is one which sees the only important unit in society as one of the individual. That an individual is willing and able to prioritize completely their economic betterment over the economic betterment of someone else. So if I am a lender who is trying to lend a poor, vulnerable person a loan such that they can buy a house, it shouldn't matter to me to check really if they have enough collateral, because ultimately the only thing that matters is my economic betterment. That is the change which deregulation makes. That means that your self-worth is based on how much money you have to a lot greater extent. I'd like to point out that that isn't true in their comparative world, because obviously we accept that the United States on both sides of the house is a capitalistic country. But I would point out that capitalism is not an absolute state. Rather, it exists in degrees. The capitalism of Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower is very different to the capitalism of Ronald Reagan and Donald Trump. I would point out that in the 1950s, even though often rates of poverty were very high, rates of homelessness were exceptionally low because individuals were expected to look after those close to them in order to prevent those sorts of harms. That individualism is harmful for three reasons. The first reason is that the most vulnerable people are always the most egregiously harmed, because in our world they are the people who are seen as the least valuable, because the only value which they have is measured completely to a much greater extent by the amount of money they own. Secondly, political discussion is more toxic because you're more willing to remove, for instance, protections of social welfare for individuals insofar as you conceive of them as having failed at some sort of economic goal which they should have tried to achieve. The third thing to say here is that it creates a society which has a lot of people who are more socially disconnected and excluded. It's a society with more homeless people. It's a society where people hark back to an idea of a 1950s America, aren't provided with it by a government because that government doesn't care about them anymore, and so they vote for fascists and they vote for Trump. Ultimately, when you judge your worth relative to other people around you and you alone are seen to be responsible for your position, you don't get any sort of benefit. The most important material in this debate is this, and here's why. The only reason why an economic crash is bad is that it makes people feel sad because they don't have any money. Our contention is that people feel sad all of the time as a result of this deregulation. The second identification to make here is with respect, no thank you, to consumption. Mass deregulation creates a society and a culture geared towards consumption. The reason for this is that the most important deregulation took place in the context of giving normal consumers, normal Americans, the money to buy things which they wouldn't have been able to before. It wasn't really college loans because they existed already to a huge extent. That's kind of all banks did for an awfully long time. Rather, it was getting a mortgage on a second house. It was getting a remortgage on that house. It was getting a loan so you could buy a car. That created a culture towards complete short-termism, that you were willing to put yourself in an economically precarious position, and you should be willing to do so, because if you're not truly American and you're not buying in to what the economic, no thank you, culture of that time dictates to you. This culture is harmful for two reasons. The first reason is that obviously insofar as that is seen as important, that happiness is very fleeting in instances that you use it, but lose it rather. Secondly, that happiness is measured relatively. So that is to say most vulnerable people are harmed because they don't have the same sort of economic capital which is necessary to access that consumption. No thank you. Thirdly, a culture of inequality. Mass deregulation creates inequality. This is just empirically indisputable, right? They tell you all about how, no thank you, the most vulnerable people on their side of the house are empowered by their proposition. I would point out that the working wage in the United States has actively declined relative to inflation since the 1980s. So that is just empirically false and can in no way be empirically true. But it is empirically indisputable that inequality has also risen. That is because the most important identification here is that the risk always lies with people who don't have any capital. That is to say that if your loan goes wrong and you can't pay back your mortgage, you're completely screwed. But insofar as you're a bank who are giving loans, you're going to get bailed out anyway, so that risk never lies with you, but the benefit always does, because that loan is potentially getting paid back. In and of itself, that inequality is harmful for two reasons. The first reason is it creates a society which is less democratic insofar as people are more disconnected from each other, but also insofar as big financial institutions have more capacity to affect political discourse because they have more money to donate to things like lobbying, and also a component of deregulation of financial institutions is deregulation on things like political donations. That is in this debate, and you get more of that on your side of the house. But secondly, it's a society which is generally less cohesive, a society which is shown to have more crime, a society which is shown to have higher rates of depression. Culture is the most important thing in this debate. We win it. Happy to
I thank the member of government and call the member of opposition.
I'm going to start by making the radical claim that CG are out of this debate on the basis that money is good for things other than feeling happy. Those things include money, those things include shelter, those things include being able to buy and interact with other people. I'm also just going to make the radical claim that the American dream and the rhetoric of American exceptionalism will probably exist on either side of the House and has very little to do specifically with this policy. So as much as they wanted to shit on America and also capitalism, that was all well and good, but it doesn't win the debate. Okay, 3 things in this speech then. 1, I'm going to provide an explanation of the specific types of growth that you do not get under this policy. So not just saying what our opening said, which is that growth is good, but explaining specifically what exact kinds of growth you do not get and why as a result you have a smaller market, and that is the world that OG have to defend. Secondly, I'm going to talk about the specific risks of a smaller and simpler market, including a lesser degree of international cohesion and a greater ability to fuck around with other people's economies and not care about the global poor, which is a massive, massive harm on their side of the House. But before I do that, let me just clarify the clash in this debate, right? Because what government have to stand for is, first of all, a smaller market in real terms. That just means a smaller number of things you can buy, a smaller amount of money that is moving around, and a much higher restriction on what you can invest in. It is not just the case that growth would happen anyway, but it would be smaller growth, more narrow growth, and growth only in things you were sure could be secure. But secondly, you have a lower interdependency of markets, right? It is not just the case that you will have these smaller ones, but also that they are specifically contained geographically or nationally and don't move across borders. That is a huge problem, right? But more than that, I think what deregulation does is it reduces the incentives for protectionism and trade hostility, and that is something that their side has to defend. They have to defend the idea that deregulation leads to being more dependent and more willing to lend to other people and more likely to interact with them. Okay, substantive. First of all, on the stuff about financial products, right? Because it isn't just the case that growth is good, but when the market becomes smaller, it necessarily becomes less elastic. It becomes less able to deal with risk. So here's one of the things that happens on their side of the house is you get some kind of financial crash, probably the housing crash on either side, because it's one of those things that you think is pretty secure, pretty legit that people own houses, but then you cannot bounce back quickly because you are unable to diversify, you are unable to invest in other things, and you are unable to get back to where you were before the crash. Yeah, sure, it took 2 years where we were in economic crisis, but we sure as hell bounced back quicker than we did from the Great Depression, which in fairness was the meth that they supported, right? They wanted that level of regulation, right? So Sophie tells us it's ridiculous to mention the 40s. Why are you guys in the 1920s, right? You are defending a state in the world where it's much slower recovery. So those people who do lose out on your side of the house don't gain that money back at any point, and that is a massive problem, right? But more than that, the fastest growing bits of our economy in this day and age are things like tech. They're industries where the actual money is something that we don't really understand how we're making yet, right? So we're making money off Snapchat and Facebook and Instagram because we're making money off of their market shares. We're making money off of the fact that they're making money and people think they're going to be making money. Those are the biggest growing areas of our economy now and going forward, probably for the next 20 years. And if you introduce the kind of regulation that they want to talk about, where you have to be absolutely certain exactly how these business models are making money before you invest invest in them. Things that we take for granted in this day and age that make our lives much better never get off the ground. Things like Facebook, things like Instagram, things like that that actually are making huge amounts of money, drive massive amounts of employment. That is the comparative. It's not just that like there would be slower growth on our side, but specific and huge chunks of the economy that we rely on today don't exist at all, which means that people are unable to get those kind of jobs, people are unable to move forward. It's a smaller market in real terms because you just don't have those areas propelling growth because they never get invested in because they're too risky. What happens when you have a smaller market in real terms? That money never goes to the people that need it. That money can never be redistributed throughout the system, right? When Tex wants to talk about like some kinds of financial things or where rich people take risks, good, I would love it if rich people take their money, put it in the market and stand a risk of it going away and going somewhere else. If you don't have the ability to invest in financial incentives and you don't have the ability to potentially make a return on that, you are more likely as someone who is wealthy to sit on your wealth and not to spend it, not to put it into the economy and have that spread around. It is good on our side of the house that people feel like there are massive incentives to spend their money, to invest in things, to risk that money in such a way as to mean that you could get a redistribution of wealth. The problem is when wealth collects at the top and doesn't move anywhere. And when you regulate the markets like that, the wealth stays with those we trust. It stays with those people at the top and you never get that redistribution. Cool, okay. Second thing, talking about international peace, right? But first of all, I'll take Tex.
Our case reduces things like subprime loans or instruments that are too complex for regulators to understand. In light of that, why are these things uniquely necessary to help the economy bounce back?
I mean, it is uniquely necessary to be able to give out loans to people who are risky after a financial crash in order for those people to get better. Like, that just seems pretty intuitive to me, right? Like, you need to be able to, in a time of financial crash when you can't be certain of lots of things, be confident that you can give that money back out into the economy so you stand any chance of bouncing back, because otherwise you just end up in a recession for a much, much longer time because you need to spend money to make money. Okay, cool. International peace, right? Because one of the things about having a more complicated financial market is that it means that most loans and most kinds of money are not held specifically in one country, or bonds are not held specifically by one bank. These impacts are twofold. One is that you have more banks that are able to spend money and able to trade in different things. That means you have a greater diversity in the market and you are less likely to get things like oligopolies. You are less likely to have Goldman Sachs be the only bank in the world that is able to trade, and if they crash, then everything crashes, right? You are just less likely to have a few people concentrated with all of the money, because with lower regulations, it's easier to enter the market. It's easier to set up hedge funds, which, by the way, are great. It makes it easier to set up different parties that can invest in different things, and it makes it much easier to make that kind of money. But more than that, it also means that specifically as a country, you are not incentivized to dick around in other countries' economies, right? Because the 1980s was the height of the Cold War, right? It is a time where you can mess with the trading in other countries and you can punish them. When you deregulate the market, you end up with markets like the USA and Russia being far more interconnected because money spreads across the various different banks in those two countries, and things are held by both parties. So bonds are, like double bonds are held between the bank in Pakistan and Credit Suisse, right? What is good about that is it means that you no longer have any incentive to mess with other countries. We are living in an era of, like, I know it's difficult to believe, but like unprecedented peace, right? Where our biggest threat are people who are outside of the global economy, right? We're talking about people like North Korea who aren't engaged in this trade market. When you create a huge amount of market incentives that are very complicated, it means that this is better, but it also means that it's less susceptible to problems with basic or like normal things, right? So you are less susceptible to things like OPEC being able to dick around the oil price and have that crash the global economy, because you have more complicated and better ways of making sure that you keep making money even when certain specific industries crash, right? So deregulation leads to a greater interdependency of these markets, which leads to better and more responsible decisions being made. We win against our opening because you tell you specifically what kind of growth doesn't happen, and we bring you this material. We win the debate because opening government are stuck in the 20s. Very proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition and call the government whip.
FDR had a dream of an America where people cared for each other, where all people worked together for a common purpose, which was the American dream. It was a dream that drove Western societies for many decades, and it was a dream that Ronald Reagan shattered and replaced with his own version of it. The role of government in society, the character of political discussions, and the way that we think about right and wrong and perceive ourselves in relation to the world around us were captured by the culture of mass deregulation, by the dictatorship of the individual, and by the mantra that greed is good. Look, we didn't talk about economics, even though all three other teams did in this debate. I'm going to explain to you why that was the winning decision. Before I do, I want to clear up two comparative points. The first one is the world that we are talking about was a response to the exact kind of Great Depression, mass deregulation that they're talking about. The world that we're talking about was a world with a great deal of investment in economies, which was why inequality was at its lowest. No, thank you. Was at its lowest in the last 200 years and that kind of thing. The second point that I want to make is that generally both op teams have characterised our side as mass regulation. In fact, they are the extreme side. We don't have to adopt the most draconian, worst version of regulation in order to get the benefits that we're talking about. Particularly for Dan and my extension, this is because it's to do with the character of the way in which we make decisions politically and how we perceive economies in the world to function. So, right, if you value mass deregulation and that kinds of thing, you're tending to value an individualism and all of those other kinds of things. So thank you. You don't need absolute regulation to have discussion and culture change in the way that we describe. So a lot of their harms, which I'll talk about in a minute, which are dependent on having the most draconian kinds of regulation or the most severe version of this policy, fall out of the debate because of their failure to adequately shade and characterise and take us at our best. So firstly, to do with this extension, right? Our contention is that when the economy's most important industry and your political structures which are causing these policies to be in place are debating and discussing and adopting policies which carry a paradigm of individualism, which say that there is no such thing as society, that government's job is to get out of the way, that the most important thing for you to do is to consume as much as possible and to have as much as possible, that shapes the way that we think and disconnects us from each other, both because of the impact of that discussion itself and the policies that results in. So, for example, the inequality that we said that this results in separates people from each other who before would have lived together or felt some kind of community with each other. The resentment and the complete difference of lifestyle means that those people are unable to connect with each other in a way that they were before. That changes the individual behaviours of all of us. It changes how likely we are to look after each other and look after the people who are in need of help. It changes the kinds of policies that our governments are going to implement, less things like social housing, less things like public investment, less looking after the poor, because that would be a government overreach which contravenes the kind of philosophy of government that they've endorsed, and it changes how all of us feel, because all of us are existing and surrounded by rhetoric that bombards us with individualism and divides us from the people around us and makes us think that we should only look out for ourselves or that we are the most important people. I think So there's all of those impacts, and then there's the kind of secondary level, and you know, I think that you have to think about so much of the rhetoric that's coming in the United States at the moment, so many of those reactionary kinds of talk, as some kind of longing for the past, as, you know, some people trying to reclaim something. Our contention is that, at least to some extent, those people are trying to reclaim a moment when they all felt like they were in the same country, and that country was America or Britain or wherever it is. And that they have lost that damages the political and cultural structures of our society severely. We got no response to this. And I knew they would get arrogant about this. Any Irish team who's spoken against a team from that university knows that they would get arrogant about this. But I don't mind, because we're going to be in a Euros final and they are not. Now, onto the weighing portion of the speech. Firstly, weighing this against the economic analysis of opening government and opening opposition. Because I think opening government do a good job of showing you how there will be economic harms. I think there are probably some economic harms on both sides of the house and so on. But our extension explains how economic harms translate into impacts for people. because of our extension, you can understand why the economic harm is severe, because when your government and society aren't there to look out for you when things go badly for you, that's when you're going to face the kind of poverty and the kind of situation that they describe. But also, because this is the case regardless, the economy will probably be sometimes good and sometimes bad. Basically, every economy of all ever, except for medieval Japan, was sometimes good and sometimes bad. In both of those situations, people are unhappy, people are poor, people are starving because of our extension far more than they are on their side of the house. So we make their impacts actually accrue or make them meaningful, but also we undercut them by taking it in a new direction and having new impacts to what opening government and opening opposition describe. I'll take closing.
So your problem is that there will be less money and people, there's less money and people feel sad. Our problem is that our extension is an example of how you make more money, which means fewer people are poor and you can redistribute that.
No, but the point of it, the point is that sometimes people have more money and sometimes people have less money on both sides of the house. Why does having less money make you feel sad, right? Because if you don't have a home, but you have all kinds of people to look after you and have you stay in their homes until you get on your feet again, then that doesn't matter as much. If you don't have a home and the government is providing social housing until you are able to get a home for yourself, that doesn't matter as much. But if you don't have a home and don't have money and you live in a society that isn't willing to provide those things for you and people aren't connected to each other and people aren't looking out to you and you feel completely politically disenfranchised, that's significantly worse. Dealing with their extension specifically, two things. First of all, they said, oh, this is closing opposition. Oh, who knows how Snapchat make money? I mean, I do, they make money from ads. But secondly, a lot of these companies are actually quite risky. So Twitter runs at a loss and are therefore they don't make sense to give loans to. So probably this is going to be fine and that those industries are going to survive and make us money. The other thing that they said, and again, I mean, you know, our stuff undercuts this, so I'm just, you know, doing this as kind of a formality. But the other thing that they said was that when there are more banks and more competitors in the economy, crashes are absorbed more. I think that actually, I mean, first of all, the economies can still be big and international on our side of the house. They were in the 50s. But I think that what they do is they make institutions far more interdependent upon each other. Because all of these institutions need each other in order to be making money, which is exactly the kind of thing that we're regulating against and that most regulators would regulate against. So when a crash happens on their side of the house, it brings down so many more people because of that interdependence than it does on our side of the house. But most importantly, it makes us all feel alone and poor and divided. We're proud to propose.
I thank the government's whip and call the opposition whip.
We live in an unprecedented age of peace, an unprecedented age of cooperation in international trade, and technologies like the internet bringing us together that we contend are much less likely if we buy the proposition case. So, three things in this summary. Firstly, the culture stuff, the responses to closing gov. Secondly, the specific economic comparative. What do we get and not get depending on how much regulation we have? Thirdly, why more money causes more peace. So firstly, to closing gov. Now the first comment I would have is it's pretty bold for the Irish, a country who was saved by global capitalism in 2008, coming in to give them loans that would have been regulated out by their side of the house, to say that capitalism has destroyed them. But more specifically, let's look at their extension. Our biggest problem here is that we've been given a really clear comparative as to what it is that this means that is substantially different from just generally the American dream, the idea of American exceptionalism, the idea of isolationism that Kate pointed out and received no response to. They said FDR had awful rhetoric, or FDR had good rhetoric, but it's pretty much word for word the exact same thing that Trump says, albeit with one or two more
colourful pieces of language. It's deeply unclear what it is that changed on their side of the house. They said now we'll have an incentive to give loans to help the good of the people. I mean, what? That's just not true. It was true in the 30s that the only reason why you gave loans to people is because you thought you could make money back from them eventually. So it's very unclear what significantly changes. He says that people don't care about the poor anymore. Well, no, they do, because crucially we give them an incentive to make the poor a market, because they're regulated out under your side of the house because they're too risky to lend to. Under our side of the house, when that barrier is lower, you can lend money to them, which means they then go and buy things with that money. People set up goods and services to sell things to those people. Crucially, deregulation creates markets out of people which don't have very much money, both in the USA, which is where they like to talk about, but also in the rest of the world. So that is incredibly important. And, you know, our general contention, therefore, is even if we believe CG that this has resulted in we would have an increased desire for social housing or whatever, that's meaningless if we don't have the money to actually build the houses in the first place. So when they say we don't know whether there'll be more or less money on either side of the house, that seems an odd claim to make, given that the other three teams have been arguing about why specifically there might be more or less money on either side of the house. So what is the specific comparative? Point 2. Firstly, we say there is this general reduction in regulation leads to, fewer products, smaller economies, crucially less interjectors. They say that we are the parodical case where we have no regulation. I mean, no. To the extent that you are not going to regulate absolutely everything out, we're equally not going to regulate absolutely nothing. Crucially, our mechanism of boom and bust is self-correcting, because in the specific instances that OG identified, if this was a thing that needed to be regulated, when we had the financial crash, the instant response wasn't regulate everything, it was regulate the very specific things that caused us problems in the first place. So our method is actually self-correcting in the most damaging of cases. Boom and bust is an iterative process by which we get the best possible regulations. But specifically on crashes, I mean, fine, we're just going to say that this is a necessary part of the economic cycle. It's kind of fine and we don't matter it in the first place. But secondly, as Kate pointed out, these crashes become firstly less likely, but secondly less damaging. Why? Firstly, because we think that to the extent that crashes are always likely to happen, they happen because, resources run out. There's a war somewhere, which means that the oil prices drop or barriers go up to international trade. The housing crash will probably happen on both sides of the house, not because there wasn't regulating, but because the people regulating, and tech says, oh, but we defund the regulators. No, by having a massive global market that means it's really important that the regulators do their job very well, they are way better funded than they were in the era of the Great Depression. The point is that sometimes you just can't predict these things. You can't always know, and the financial crash was a good example of that, just because of the sheer volume of data that was available. So what this means is that inevitably when a crash happens on either side of the house, why is it better on our side of the house? Firstly, there is more diversity in what banks invest their things in, because there are more products, which means that an individual crash in an individual thing doesn't cause a huge financial crash. Secondly, the risk is spread over many different banks and many different institutions, which means that there is a smoothing out effect rather than an explicit domino effect. Thirdly, we get quicker recoveries. Why? Because in the 2008 financial crisis, people who might have been priced out of the market because they didn't have enough, collateral to deal with, lots of Irish companies, were given huge amounts of money by the EU and the IMF because they weren't regulated out, which means that when that crash happened, we had a huge incentive to get the economy moving, but crucially, we had the ability to do so. So these risky loans are incredibly important. But next, specifically our extension and why it's so important, the substantive stuff. No, thank you. Why money causes peace. In fact, I tell a lie. I will take Sophie.
Matt, judges, look at your notes. Examine the specific regulations text told you were inevitable in our alternative in first bit of this debate, and the alternative industries in my speech that I gave structural reasons why they were likely. Will you be the first opposition speaker to stop strawmanning and respond to our case as we made it?
I mean, you can say the word strawmanning, but it doesn't mean that I am actually doing it. So, next, and again, judges, look at your note, but I'll go on to it now. So why money causes peace? Firstly, direct financial incentive. They say it's really bad that the US's debt has gone really high. We say it's great because most of that debt is held by China. It means, crucially, there is very little incentive to engage in direct conflict. Probably it wouldn't be World War III, but the little nefarious proxy wars that we like to have. It's the incentives for them to mess around in the South China Sea still exist, but now there is incentive to not escalate those tensions. Secondly, there is incentive to not engage in costly trade wars, because those are damaging for both sides, whereas before, the 30s and 40s were an unending age of protectionism and tariffs where we tried to protect our own industries. Now we have things like the EU, the Common Economic Zone, the TTP, rest in peace, we get these things on our side of the house which liberate markets and we think are incredibly important. But particularly, why is it that deregulation causes this? Because of interconnectedness. It's much easier for me to make a loan in another part of the world that I might not know under their side of the house enough knowledge to say that this is definitely a safe bet. Crucially, when I give this money, it is cyclical. It builds on itself, because once I put some loans in this country, I have an invested interest in that country being stable. This works both in the case of things like China, but also smaller countries. As the Soviet Union fell, I have a huge incentive to start plowing money into Romania, because now it's a market I can exploit. But crucially, I have an incentive for Romania to stay stable for the foreseeable future. Under their side of the house, the only way to get money out of these countries, or the only way to get money out of Africa, is to just deplete it of all the resources. And it doesn't matter what happens to the rest of the country. It doesn't matter what happens to everyone else. Crucially, financial markets work on the economy being stable, and that relies on trust. This level of trust means that I do care what happens in these countries, regardless of where I am in the world, because war and conflict is bad for business. So ultimately, these loans that might be mexed out under their side of the house are actually really useful, because yes, in the West, sometimes they lead to things like Facebook that we wouldn't have the ability to recognize were good, but crucially, it means we just give loans to poor people in Nigeria because we can make money out of them. Under our side of the house, we make the global poor a market that we give money to that lifts them out of poverty, side with capitalism, side with closing up.